findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that tells us that principally climate change is the result of the actions of human beings and human institutions. In other words, it's not an accident of nature. It's the direct result of policies and practices in the public and in the private sectors. So that means it's principally human-induced. If you hold that against the obligations of all states in the world to promote and to protect human rights, and to take affirmative steps, not just to stand back and not violate human rights, but to actually take steps to protect human rights, you see a direct conflict. We think a direct breach of those human rights obligations. Taking steps to cause climate change represents a breach if it impacts directly on human rights, and we know that it does. What we want to see is that the response in Paris and beyond is one that takes account of the human rights impacts of climate change. So, for example, we know, as a matter of evidence, that climate change directly impacts on the right to health, the right to water and sanitation, the right to adequate housing, even for people living on small island developing states, the right to self-determination. Where is your self-determination when you're compelled to become a climate migrant and to leave your homeland and find yourself as a climate refugee somewhere else? And of course, it can impact directly on the right to life. And we know that thousands have lost their right to life as a direct result of climate change. It's important that in the response there is accountability for breaches, that those who are responsible for climate change and its impacts on human rights are held accountable through effective regulation, through effective policies to make sure those harms aren't caused, and where they are, that there is redress for those harms for victims. We want to make sure that the human rights principle of participation is respected and integrated into the responses, so that those people most affected, often indigenous peoples, minorities, migrants, persons with disabilities, older persons, and as I said, people living in small island development states or coastal communities, that their voices are heard in the response, are respected and are responded to. We know that the 2-degree limit, which is the target for Paris, will help us to avoid the worst harms from climate change, including harms on human rights, but it will not help us to avoid all of them. If we are well beyond that target in Paris, that's not just an intergovernmental political challenge. It is a very fundamental human rights challenge. We want to make sure that states are aware of that, aware of their obligations, and that they respond in a way that will address those obligations effectively. If we don't get the kind of agreement that we need around the limitation of carbon emissions, around financing so that developing countries can take the steps they need to reposition their own economies in ways that are climate neutral and are green, to use the term. If that doesn't happen, we're going to need to see a much stronger human rights response to this challenge.